the 7-year-old surviving sister of a Wyoming mom's murder-suicide that killed her 3 young siblings, has also died. Tranyelle Harshman. At exactly 3:44 p.m. on February 15, 2025, Olivia Blackmer took her last breath. For 5 days, she had fought to survive, clinging to life with unimaginable strength. But in the end, her body could take no more. Her passing marked the final chapter in a tragedy that had already claimed the lives of her 3 siblings. The world may never fully grasp the horror of what unfolded in that Wyoming home, but one thing remains certain. Olivia Blackmer's fight was not in vain. Her story, and the story of her family, must be told. On February 10, 2025, a tragic event shook the small town of Byron, Wyoming. Tranyelle Harshman, a devoted mother, was found to have taken the lives of her 4 children before turning the weapon on herself. 2-year-old twins Brooke and Jordan, along with 9-year-old Braylee, were pronounced dead at the scene. Against all odds, 7-year-old Olivia survived, but her fight was short-lived. For 5 agonizing days, her family, her community, and even strangers from across the country prayed for a miracle. But Olivia's injuries were too severe. At 7:52 a.m., a 911 call was placed. The dispatcher's voice was calm but firm as they tried to make sense of the frantic, barely comprehensible words coming from the other end. A neighbor had heard gunshots, multiple gunshots. Then silence. Moments later, a chilling scream cut through the air before everything went quiet again. Law enforcement officers from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene within minutes. As they approached the home, there were no immediate signs of forced entry, no shattered windows or doors left ajar. The house, a modest single-story home with pale blue siding, looked just like any other in the quiet town. But what lay inside was anything but ordinary. Officers knocked, announcing their presence. No response. The door was locked. The lead officer signaled to his team before forcing their way in. The moment they stepped inside, the metallic scent of blood filled their noses. The living room was eerily undisturbed, save for a few overturned toys scattered on the floor. A child's doll lay on its side, its tiny plastic fingers stained red. Then they saw the first body. Braylee, just 9 years old, was slumped against the couch, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The wound was clear, a single gunshot to the chest. A few feet away, the bodies of 2-year-old twins Brooke and Jordan lay on the carpet, their tiny forms unnaturally still. The officers moved cautiously through the house, checking each room. Then, in the master bedroom, they found her. Tranyelle Harshman lay on the bed, a handgun resting loosely in her hand. Blood pooled beneath her head. There was no doubt, this was a murder-suicide. Just as the officers were about to call it in, a faint noise came from the corner of the room. A gasp, a small, shallow breath. One officer turned sharply, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. Then he saw her, Olivia. She was barely clinging to life. A gunshot wound had torn through her abdomen, yet somehow she was still breathing. News of the tragedy spread quickly. Local reporters gathered outside, their breath visible in the cold morning air as they relayed the horrifying details to a shocked public. Residents of Byron, a town where everyone knew everyone, were left reeling. How could this have happened? What could have driven Tranyelle, a mother who had always been seen as loving and devoted, to commit such an unspeakable act? As Olivia fought for her life in the hospital, investigators worked tirelessly to piece together what had led to that fateful morning. What they discovered would shake the community to its core. Tranyelle Harshman was known in her community as a caring mother, a woman who loved her children deeply. Friends and family described her as dedicated, always putting her kids first. But behind the surface, cracks were forming. She had struggled with postpartum depression after the birth of her twins, Brooke and Jordan. Her husband, Cliff, had expressed concerns about her well-being, but she assured him she was handling things. Over time, her struggles intensified. She had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, following a traumatic experience in her past, and it was something she had battled quietly for years. Close friends noticed changes in her behavior, withdrawn conversations, increased anxiety, moments of deep sadness. Some recalled times when she seemed distant, overwhelmed, and exhausted. Her husband, Cliff Harshman, stated that he knew his wife was struggling, but never imagined she was capable of something so devastating. She was an incredible mom, he told reporters. She loved those kids more than anything. This wasn't her. This was her illness. Even her ex-husband, Quinn Blackmer, the father of Braylee and Olivia, echoed similar sentiments. Mental illness isn't just a willpower thing. It's chemical imbalances in your brain. It's damaged pathways, he wrote in a Facebook post. She needed help, but none of us saw just how deep the pain had gone. Were there warning signs? Some believe so. She had visited doctors, received treatment, and taken medication, but the struggle remained. On the surface, she functioned as a mother should, caring for her children, taking them to school, making meals. But inside, she was battling an invisible storm. What led her to that fateful day? Was there a breaking point? Investigators searched for answers, uncovering a history of mental health struggles, financial stress, and isolation that may have contributed to the tragedy. In the wake of the tragedy, grief settled like a heavy fog over the surviving family members. Quinn Blackmer, Olivia's father, struggled to put his devastation into words. His social media posts reflected a man grappling with an unspeakable loss, caught between sorrow and disbelief. He shared a heartbreaking image of his daughters edited with angel wings, writing, "The peace I find is knowing that my babies don't have to be apart from each other, and they can also be with their other sisters." For Cliff Harshman, Tranyelle's husband, the grief was intertwined with confusion and anger. In interviews, he expressed deep pain, but also frustration, trying to make sense of why the woman he loved, the mother of his children, had done the unthinkable. He described her struggles with mental illness, postpartum depression, PTSD, and other psychological battles that seemed to intensify in recent months. Other relatives voiced their heartbreak online, struggling to reconcile their memories of Tranyelle as a caring, devoted mother with the actions that led to this horrific outcome. They were left with endless questions. Was this preventable? Did the system fail her? Could someone have intervened? A candlelight vigil was held outside the family's home, where neighbors, teachers, and friends gathered in silent tribute. Olivia's school held a special ceremony, with classmates releasing white balloons in her honor. An online tribute page flooded with messages of grief, prayers, and support. Beyond the memorials, community members started discussions about mental health awareness and support for struggling parents. Conversations arose about postpartum depression, PTSD, and the resources, or lack thereof, available for those in crisis. Tranyelle had reportedly battled postpartum depression after the birth of her twins. The additional stress of raising 4 children, combined with possible unresolved trauma, created a storm inside her mind. Investigators discovered that Tranyelle had recently sought therapy, but it was unclear if she had been consistent with treatment. Some reports suggested that she had been on medication, but had stopped taking it due to side effects or financial struggles. Medical professionals reviewing her history suggested that a combination of untreated or mismanaged mental illness, emotional distress, and lack of immediate intervention may have played a role. Investigators traced the firearm used in the shooting. It was legally owned, but questions arose about how Tranyelle accessed it in a moment of crisis. law enforcement pieced together her final hours through phone records, social media activity, and messages sent to friends. Some reports indicated that she had been in emotional distress that day, possibly feeling isolated or overwhelmed. However, one question remained unanswered. What was the breaking point? Mental health advocates began calling for stronger resources and intervention programs, especially for mothers struggling with postpartum depression. Gun safety debates resurfaced, with discussions on whether mental health screenings should play a larger role in firearm access. Some questioned whether law enforcement or social services should have been involved earlier, highlighting gaps in the system. This wasn't just a crime. It was a crisis that had spiraled beyond control. The loss of Olivia, Braley, Brooke, and Jordan became a painful reminder of the importance of mental health awareness, early intervention, and community support. But for those left behind, no policy change or investigation could undo the devastation. For Quinn Blackmer, Cliff Harshman, and the families of these innocent children, the only thing left was grief, and the hope that their story would serve as a warning, a lesson, and perhaps a call to action to prevent another tragedy like this from ever happening again. This tragedy is not just about one family. It's about a system that often fails those who are suffering the most. It's about the silent battles fought behind closed doors, the warning signs that go unnoticed, and the deep stigma that keeps people from reaching out for help. Experts say that untreated mental illness doesn't always lead to violence, but when combined with severe stress, isolation, and lack of support, it can become a dangerous tipping point. Dr. Amanda Fisher, a leading psychologist specializing in maternal mental health, explains, when mothers experience postpartum depression, PTSD, or other severe mood disorders, they can feel hopeless. And when hopelessness turns to desperation, the mind can go to dark places. Without proper intervention, some reach a crisis point. Studies show that many cases of familicide involve a history of mental health struggles that went unaddressed, not necessarily by choice, but because resources were scarce, stigmatized, or difficult to access. Similarly, domestic violence and mental illness often overlap. While Tranyelle had no reported history of abuse, many similar cases do. How many victims go unheard before something irreversible happens? We hear this story again and again. And each time we ask, what could have been done differently? In the final moments of Olivia's life, she was surrounded by love. Family members whispered to her, held her tiny hands, and hoped for the impossible. But when her heart stopped beating, so did the last thread of hope. The world didn't just lose 4 innocent children. It lost a chance to do better, to recognize pain before it turns into tragedy, to step in when someone is drowning in darkness. As we close Olivia's story, we must ask ourselves, mental illness is often invisible until tragedy strikes. How many more families will suffer before real change happens? This story is heartbreaking, but it's one that needs to be told. Too often, tragedies like this fade from the headlines, leaving behind only grief and unanswered questions. But we can't look away. We need to talk about mental health, domestic struggles, and the warning signs that go unnoticed. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, if you want to see more deep, investigative content that uncovers the truth behind real-life tragedies, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're joining a community that seeks awareness, understanding, and change. Hit the like button if this story moved you, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think needs to change to prevent tragedies like this? Your voice matters.